Well, it is good to see everyone this evening. Glad that we can have this time of worship and study together. If you remember, I mentioned last week, it doesn't really seem that long ago, it doesn't seem like a whole week has gone by, but last Sunday night we kind of wrapped up our apologetics series that we've been looking at over different kind of scientific evidences for Christ, or not for Christ, but I guess kind of for Christ, for God and things like that. But we were looking at some of those things. But I mentioned last time that I wanted us to spend a little bit of time over the next few weeks to dig into some things in Hebrews that we've alluded to, but I want to spend maybe a little bit more time there in terms of the people mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to wrap up Hebrews and kind of finish it out the way we've been doing it on Wednesday nights, but for our purposes for the next few weeks on Sunday nights, I want us to just focus in a little more on why some of the people listed in Hebrews 11 are there. Why, of all the people that could be picked, and you think about it, there are a ton of people we could pick to, exemplify faith in Hebrews 11. Why are these particular people picked? What is it that stands out about them and their faith? Some of them, like Abraham, for example, we're told a whole lot about why they're there, right? We're told several different decisions they make, several different things they do that show their faith. But some of them were given maybe one episode, like the one we'll look at tonight, or maybe not even anything is mentioned specifically. They're just mentioned by name, and then that's all there is to it. So I want us to spend a little bit of time to dig into some of those. Some of them ask why in the world they're here in the first place, because they don't seem like good examples of faith, maybe. Others look at them and say, we know that they were faithful, but maybe get a little more of appreciation of how much faith they exhibited given their circumstances. So tonight, I want to start with Joseph. As I said, we have several mentions of Abraham and a lot of things that he does, and so I didn't really feel like it would be, I felt like it would kind of be a little bit overkill to talk more about Abraham since we've already talked so much about him in detail. But Joseph, if you look in Hebrews 11, we only have one little verse about him at the very end of his life demonstrating faith. I want us to spend a little bit of time just talking about the story of Joseph. As always, true story, but told as a story for us. I want us to spend a little bit of time thinking about this story and thinking about how it leads up to that ultimate demonstration of faith he gives at the end of his life. So let's just think for a moment about the story of David. We're going to kind of go through this, as we like to do, as a story. And I want us to think about maybe some things we're going to try and emphasize as we look at Joseph's life. So we start out with Joseph. We're told that Joseph is born into a rather unfortunate situation. If any of y'all were born with siblings, I was not, so I can't relate really, but if any of y'all were born with siblings, you're probably aware of the concept of favoritism. Now, I hope for your sake that it was a false accusation that was made either towards you or from you towards your siblings that your parents were playing favorites. But unfortunately, that was not the case in Joseph's situation. Joseph was very clearly the favorite, and that was not a healthy dynamic in his family. And the problem was not just that they were favorite children, but they were favorite wives among the whole family. If you remember, Leah and Rachel were both given to Jacob, and then there are also concubines that are thrown into the mix when you have the servant of Leah and the servant of Rachel. But Rachel is always and remains always Jacob's favorite. Already a recipe for domestic disaster, as we've even talked about before in a different context. So when Joseph is born to Rachel, he immediately gets the favorite status. He is raised to be, I guess, for lack of a better term, spoiled, pampered, it seems, from an early age. And I don't know if you've done much reading into like child psychology and stuff like that. I don't think you really have to understand what's happening here, but children already think they're kind of the center of everything when they first begin to learn about the world. But when you add to that a clear favoritism being shown, that automatically is a recipe for not a very nice person when they grow up, right? So Joseph is being treated this way, and we even get a sense that maybe some of it does begin to go to his head a little bit, although we can't tell for sure. But we see as he gets a little bit older, he gets old enough to, speak and interact with his family and with his siblings, He has dreams. One of the dreams that he has, he essentially sees a large group of bushels of grain and things like that, and they're all gathered together, but then his essentially is separated, and all the other bushels of grain bow down to him. He has another dream where the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bow down to him. Now, what do you think that would do to you as a child? To have images of grandeur in such a way? It might have a little bit of a corrupting influence, you think? And certainly the fact that he shares these dreams with his whole family seems to perhaps indicate that he's proud of these dreams that he's had about himself. Even his father at one point scolds him. Remember, favorite son. Still, he scolds him for this, saying, "What, are you saying that your entire family is going to bow down to you?" So we have this upbringing. This is not the kind of upbringing that is going to set someone up for humility, that is going to set someone up for submission. This is the kind of upbringing that is most likely going to set someone up to kind of balk at rules. The kind of upbringing that's going to set someone up to not necessarily do what someone like a father or even God the Father would expect from them. But of course, the physical consequences come long before any other consequences, because his brothers get tired of it. He is given that coat as a symbol of his favorite status, whether it be translated as the coat of many colors. Some translations have it just as like the coat of, great worth or something like that. So we're not exactly sure what it meant, but whatever it was a coat that stood out. It was a symbol of his status in his father's eyes. And that was the final straw. His brothers, of course, they're all older than him except for Benjamin. His brothers, they get together, they say, "We're tired of this pipsqueak, we want to get rid of him." And so they conspire, they essentially grab him, tie him up, throw him in a pit while he shows up by himself among them. And they're trying to figure out what to do with him. At first they want to kill him, at least they're talked down from that, thankfully. But eventually they see a caravan coming by, where they're trying to feed their flock. The caravan is passing through that area. And they say, "Well, why don't we just sell him as a slave? Then we get money off of it, and, he's out of our hair, we're all good," and all the different dimensions of this issue. And so they do. They sell him as a slave. He's taken away by these slave traders. They get a little money off of it, and they deceive their father and say, "Oh, he must have been killed by a wild animal or something." They dip his coat in blood, to finish off the effect. Now, think about Joseph's situation at that point. He has just gone from a pampered favorite son in a pretty well-to-do family. Yes, nomadic family, meaning they don't always stay in one place for very long, but still, we see Abraham and his descendants, they're not poor people. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all have quite a bit of wealth by ancient standards. So he is a favorite son, has been a favorite son in a fairly wealthy family. And now all of a sudden he's been sold as a slave. You think that as a favorite, this is where Joseph snaps? You think that as a favorite, this is a recipe for him to just renounce everything he's ever been taught? Clearly, it's not what happens. But man, you better believe that in those kind of circumstances, Satan is just rubbing his hands together. "Oh, I got him now," right? Perfect setup for temptation. Perfect setup to make him bitter and let him live the rest of his life bitter about his change of fortune. But it keeps on getting worse, right? He's a slave, so it seems like at first, as he is sold into slavery, what's going to happen? He's never been a slave before, right? He's sold to a man named Potiphar. Potiphar also is a wealthy man, but of course this is a very different situation. However, Joseph distinguishes himself in the household of Potiphar. And so he is working in this household in ancient Egypt. Now this is a bit of a not super realistic depiction of ancient Egypt, but it kind of gives us the idea. He would have been living in a nicer neighborhood in Egypt because Potiphar was on the upper scale. He would have owned several slaves. He would have had a household that would have been managed by, some of the steward of the house. And eventually that's what Joseph becomes. He becomes the steward of the house because he has proven himself a good worker. Now, if you're the pampered favorite son, that usually doesn't create a great work ethic. And yet, Joseph distinguishes himself as a hard worker, which is very interesting in and of itself. So he distinguishes himself in the household of Potiphar. He works hard. He becomes so trustworthy that Potiphar, he essentially leaves everything in Joseph's hands, except for, of course, his wife. But that's the one thing that Joseph ultimately becomes tempted by, not because of himself, but because of Potiphar's wife. She begins to, I believe most translations say something along the lines of cast longing eyes at Joseph. Now, we're not told really anything about Potiphar's wife. We're told that Joseph was a very handsome young man. He was very, attractive in his day and time. We're not told anything about Potiphar. I think oftentimes we picture, a very beautiful Egyptian seductress in Potiphar's wife. I mean, I kind of think that she might have been an old hag that just, wanted something she couldn't get, right? But we don't know. We don't know what the situation is. We're not told. We're just told that she wanted it. Now, we don't have slavery in our country, thankfully. But if you were a slave and all of a sudden you're put in a situation like this is, once again, a recipe for absolute disaster. Because this is your master's wife. Obviously, if you fall for her, for lack of a better term, it's going to be bad if the master ever finds out, so all of a sudden you're in a dangerous situation there. But if you refuse her, this is also a terrible situation because she can quickly turn jealous, as we see she does, and find plenty of ways to get you in trouble. So this is a terrible situation. And once again, we have to go back to Joseph's faith. All of a sudden, going from favorite son to slave, automatically a good enough reason for most people to become bitter against life and against God even. But now at least things have been going well for him as a slave. He has been promoted to the highest position you could have as a slave, essentially the steward of a household among other slaves in a wealthy household. And now, once again, he's plunged back into this difficult situation. And of course, she makes her move, and he responds, very interestingly, saying that not only would this be a crime against his master, but against God. Showing us that even at this point in his life, he has not lost the faith in the God of his fathers. A faith that, let's be honest, most people would have abandoned by that time because of the circumstances of his life. I'm not saying they should have, obviously, but if we're just being honest about human nature, most people would have by now. He refuses her advances. She accuses him of trying to rape her. Again, not a situation you want to be in on either front. Whether you give in or whether you don't, it's not going to turn out well. Now, we're not exactly sure if the husband believes her fully. We know he's angry, but usually my understanding is in a situation like that, you would execute the guy if a slave tries to rape the master's wife. He only throws him in prison, which is interesting in and of itself. There is a part of me that can't help but thinking that, well, if I have a choice between being a slave in prison and being executed, maybe I'd want to be executed, right? Because I don't know that my prospects are very big either way. But nonetheless, he is thrown in jail. This is yet another time where certainly Joseph is there for doing the right thing, right? There is no scenario in which, for those who know the truth, which really at this point is just Joseph and God, there is no scenario in which Joseph should have been treated this way. He's only tried to do what's right, and he's the only one being punished for it. Potiphar's wife isn't punished, as far as we know. Potiphar isn't punished for accusing, or for sending someone to jail falsely. Joseph is the only one who gets the blame, and all because he was trying to do the right thing. If you've ever watched the movie, seen the play Wicked, it's about the Wizard of Oz, like the witch and the Wizard of Oz, and it's kind of a backstory, retelling of her backstory. There's a song in that play, and in the movie. The movie is excellent, by the way. The song in the play, and will be in the second half of the movie, they've only made the first half of the movie so far, called No Good Deed Goes Unpunished. Well, it's called No Good Deed, but that's the line. No good deed goes unpunished. Fairly common phrase, right? The idea is that at a certain point, one of the characters feels like they've only ever trying to be making the right decisions, doing good by everyone around them, and they have suffered constantly because of it. And so they kind of snap. And they say, why should I keep doing good things if I am only being punished for them? I can't help but think that Joseph might have had some of those feelings going around in his head. He's never really done anything wrong. Maybe the worst you could say is he was kind of maybe you could say he was a little bit braggy when he was a little kid, but he's a little kid. Certainly nothing to deserve the fate that he has experienced to this point. Maybe he just says, I'm done being the good guy. But he doesn't. He begins to distinguish himself so that even the keeper of the prison promotes him, which is saying something. For those of y'all, I think a few in this room at least, have worked within the justice system in one way or another. That's saying something when you have a guy that you can trust within a system like that, right? He is promoted to essentially the right-hand man of the jailer. And in the process, he reveals, this is really the first time that we see this on the other side of it, he reveals he has the ability to interpret dreams. We know he had dreams when he was a child, but now we see that God has given him the ability to interpret dreams. And so he interprets the dreams of the baker and the, I think he's called the butler, technically. He's like the guy who brings the wine to the Pharaoh. He interprets their dreams and basically says, one of you is going to be restored to your position at Pharaoh's right hand, the other one is going to be executed. Now, it's not really the interpretation that the guy who's going to be executed wanted, but nonetheless, both of those come true within the exact amount of time that Joseph says, 3 days. In 3 days, one is executed and one is restored to Pharaoh's side. Even then, things don't really go Joseph's way, at least not first. Because the guy who is restored to Pharaoh's side, Joseph pleads with him, please say something to Pharaoh. I am not here by any just reason. I should not be in prison. And the guy forgets to say anything to the guy who told him, hey, you're getting out of here. Again, a good reason to be bitter, to lose faith not just in God, but in humanity. But eventually, an incident comes up. Pharaoh has a dream. The butler does remember to say something about Joseph. Joseph is brought out of prison. Excuse me. Is brought out of prison, and he stands before Pharaoh and interprets the dream. Finally, now things begin to look up for Joseph. He is recognized as having great power, and Pharaoh is so pleased with this incident. Kind of like we might think about Daniel later on when he interprets dreams. Similar situation happens here. Joseph is promoted. He is promoted to the right-hand man of Pharaoh. All of a sudden he's a favorite again, right? He is promoted to the right hand of Pharaoh. Now, I want you to think about Joseph's situation at that moment. We might not think about it this way, but who has Joseph been following all the way up to this point in time? He's been following God, Yahweh, right? The God of his fathers. We see even when Potiphar's wife tempts him, that he responds saying, I'm not going to sin against God. In all that time, when he's been following Yahweh, has it seemed like God has really been blessing him? From a human perspective? I mean, yes, he's promoted in Pharaoh's household only to be dumped. He's promoted in jail only to be forgotten. The first time that he really seems to get a break is from Pharaoh himself. Well, Pharaoh, at this time, if our history is correct, would have been considered divine and would have been very much a spokesman for the Egyptian pantheon of idols. We don't often think about this, but this is yet another very opportune time for Joseph to say, well, my God hasn't ever done anything for me, but obviously the gods of the Egyptians favor me. And yet he doesn't, once again. He spends time working as Pharaoh's right-hand man, and eventually, because of the famine that he predicts according to Pharaoh's dream, his own brothers come to Egypt asking for help. We see him test them, and sometimes we might read this as almost kind of petty, the way he treats them. But I would argue what he's doing there, more than anything, is he's trying to feel out the situation. Where does he stand? Where are their hearts at this point? Because remember, these are the people that were going to kill him before they decided to just make a buck off of him instead. So he feels out kind of the situation. He makes sure his brother, his younger brother and his father are alive. And eventually he does reveal himself. He doesn't take vengeance. He reveals himself to his family. Not only reveals himself to his family, invites his family to come and partake in the good of the land of Egypt. I don't know, I don't think I could be that pure of heart if all that had been done to me by my brothers. Even if I was the favorite child, even if I knew somewhere deep down that they had been wronged because of the favoritism shown to me, I don't think I would want to help them out that much. And remember, these are not Egyptians. To some extent, Joseph is having to stick his neck out for these people. Try and get Pharaoh to treat them well. Well, what if Pharaoh doesn't want to? What if he doesn't want to harbor these foreigners? We can see yet another time where Joseph goes from being elevated to crashing back down to the bottom again, and yet he takes that chance anyway. Eventually, we're told, Joseph nears the end of his days, and that's when we have the specific incident recorded for us in Hebrews. Joseph tells his children, his descendants, he says, when you leave Egypt, as God has promised that you will, when you go back to Canaan, which God has promised you will inherit, take my bones with you. I want my final resting place of my physical body to be in the land that we have been promised. That is certainly an example of faith. And we talked about it briefly as we talked about Hebrews 11. But I want us to think about how many reasons Joseph had throughout his entire life. All these incidents, how many reasons Joseph had to abandon that faith. I'm not saying they would have been legitimate reasons. I'm not saying he should have by any means. But think about how many times, how many opportunities, how many ways he could have convinced himself that this faith was foolish, that this God had abandoned him. And I want us to think about in these terms especially. Let's ask a question now that we've kind of gone through the story. What did Joseph have that we don't? When it comes to relationship with God, those types of things. What did Joseph have that we don't? Feel free to answer the question. Do what? You might say he had the eyewitness accounts of his father and his grandfather saying, God has appeared to me. Well, okay, we have eyewitness accounts written down for us, right? You might say Joseph had this ability to interpret dreams, but that's not direct communication in the same way. Like, that's something, but really when it comes down to it, there's not a whole lot Joseph had at his disposal that we don't have as well. But let's think about the other side of that. What do we have that Joseph didn't? Okay, first and foremost, we have Jesus. We have the entire plan having been revealed that Jesus came to show us. What else do we have that Joseph didn't?
Well, with Joseph, Genesis wouldn't have been around, so there was nothing really written down.
He would not have had any kind of written works. Certainly the law of Moses hasn't happened yet. That's several generations in the future. But he wouldn't even have anything except for just the word of mouth of what happened, as we said, to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob, his forefathers. But that's it. And that's just stories passed down. Now, they're true stories, and I think he believed they were true stories, but if someone passes down stories to you, You have the option to believe him or not. What else did he have, or do we have that he didn't?
We have salvation through Jesus and that blood. That blood. Joseph was a righteous person, but he still had to have Jesus' blood.
Good point. Good point. Joseph doesn't even have a concept of why salvation is needed in the way that we do. Like he, I'm sure, has been told the story of the Garden of Eden. That's been passed down. And the story of Noah. We imagine those have been passed down, orally by word of mouth. But even those aren't complete, right? Because people, just with those stories, don't have a concept of heaven and hell or of life after death. Not anything certain that they can plant their faith in. The point we're trying to make, Joseph had way less to go on than we do. Overall, he didn't have hardly any of the advantages that we do in terms of knowledge of God, knowledge of Christ, and the big plan and the big picture, salvation, all these things that we mentioned. He doesn't have any of that to go on. He doesn't have anything written down for him. He doesn't have even the old law, much less the new law. He doesn't have this huge record of eyewitnesses and miracles that God has orchestrated throughout his plan. He doesn't have any of that. Sometimes we think of people back in the Old Testament and we think, but they had, God just constantly speaking to people and this, that, and the other. It was a lot rarer than we actually think it was, number one. Usually what we see is if it happened, it was recorded. But think about how many people lived that are not part of that record, right? But not only that, in this very early time, even those direct interactions were rare. What we really see that picking up is with Israel. But that's not going to happen for another 400 years, give or take. Joseph has almost nothing to go on compared to what we have. And I don't know, I hope we would, but I don't know how many of us would hold on to our faith as long as Joseph did, given his circumstances. If we found ourselves in similar circumstances with what we have to go on now, I think some of us would become bitter. At least be pulled that way. I think some of us would feel like giving up. I think some of us would blame God. You said you were going to take care of me. What's this? And yet with far less to go on, Joseph kept his faith the entire time. We don't ever even see, now I'm sure there were times where he had doubts, where he had fears, but we don't ever see him turning away from his God. We don't see it. And all that culminates, as we said, at the very end. Not only does he still believe that God is the one true God, not only does he still believe that God is going to keep his promise and is worth following, but he believes in a promise that's going to take place that he's never even seen and has no evidence for it. There is no reason in the world, from a human perspective, for Joseph to believe that his family is ever going to take over Canaan. Remember how many people of Joseph's family come to Egypt from Canaan? Leaving Canaan, by the way. They're not going back to Canaan in his lifetime, they're leaving Canaan. There's 70 people. 70 people. That's not exactly enough to form an army out of and take an entire area in the Middle East. And yet so strong is Joseph's faith that even at his death, he says, I know this is going to happen. And in the smallest possible way, I want to be a part of it. Take my bones with you, will you? I just want to give us a sense, as we begin looking at these for the next few weeks on Sunday nights, of why Joseph is included as this example of faith. How many times, how many ways, how many good reasons did Joseph have to abandon his faith in Yahweh? A God that, as far as we can tell, he had never had any direct interactions with. Unlike Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. All three of them had talked directly with God. We have no reason to believe that Joseph ever did. And yet he still had that faith. He didn't abandon it. And if he could do all of that, with practically nothing to go on. We who have so much to go on, we shouldn't abandon ours either. That's, I think, the power of including Joseph in this list. Any last thoughts or comments before we wrap up for this evening? Next week, Lord willing, we're going to look at Gideon and Gideon's faith. Gideon is a little more interesting. I say more interesting. He's interesting because he doesn't really seem like he had faith, at least not at first. He seemed kind of like a scaredy cat. So why is he this one we should hold up as an example of faith? Well, we'll talk about that next week. But as always, the Lord's invitation is open. If there is anything that we can do to encourage you, to help you strengthen your own faith, please let us know as we stand and as we sing together. Have thine affections been nailed to the cross? Is thy heart right with God?